The early 1820s were years when the West still felt half-imagined, a place spoken of in taverns and trapping camps with the same mixture of awe and suspicion men use when discussing storms or spirits. For most Americans, the Rocky Mountains were a rumor, a jagged line on government maps that faded into blank parchment where knowledge thinned. But in Taos, the rumor walked on two legs, spoke Spanish, Comanche, English, and French, and traded in everything from mules to powder to half-forgotten stories about the land. Into this world rode Elias Boone Hardesty, lean and dusted with the miles between the Missouri River and the southern Rockies. He was not yet 30, though the furrows etched at the corners of his eyes made him look older. A rifle scar ran along his left forearm, white as chalk, and he carried himself with that quiet, deliberate economy common among men who lived more with the weather and the mountains than with other people. He had already trapped the high country of the upper Missouri, wintered with a crow band on the Yellowstone, and traveled with French engagé crews who swore every bend of the river held another devil. But Taos, this dusty square of adobe walls, rawhide roofs, and voices from a dozen nations, was something else entirely. The plaza baked in the midday sun. A lone cottonwood tree leaned over the well at its center, its sparse shade fought over by dogs, children, and the occasional burro. Smoke curled from chimneys, carrying the smell of green wood and roasted chile. Somewhere, a guitar twanged lazily. And everywhere, drifting like sparks from a cook fire, were the stories, the ones that never stayed buried, no matter how often someone swore they were lies. They called them las minas perdidas, the lost mines. Spanish mines, older than memory, carved into the high folds of the southern Rockies when the empire still reached like a long, golden finger into the northern wilderness. Mines abandoned after an Indian uprising or covered by landslides or cursed by priests, depending on who told the story. Mines filled with silver so pure it could be peeled from the rock like bark from a cottonwood. Mines that men had searched for, fought over, and died for. And always, always, there was mention of a map drawn on rawhide, or etched into a Spanish officer's journal, or carved into a rock face somewhere near the San Juan Mountains. A map men swore existed, even as they laughed at the fools who believed it. Elias first heard the tale in Taos, not from a trapper, but from an old vaquero leaning against a hitching rail, his sombrero tilted low, and a rifle older than he was slung across his lap. The old man spat tobacco juice at a passing chicken and said, "There were Spaniards in those mountains long before your American officers knew how to spell Rio Grande. They dug holes like moles, brought Indian slaves to haul the ore, hid their workings with brush. Then they vanished. All that's left is their ghosts." Another day, it came from a French trapper who had followed the Green River Rendezvous Trail down into New Mexico. He laughed so hard he nearly choked on his whiskey. "Les mines? Mon ami, every greenhorn is told that story. Always the same. Go north until the river bends wrong, west until the rocks look Spanish. Bah, myth. Just like the flatheads who say the mountains walk at night." Around a campfire on the edge of town, where the sagebrush opened into a dry arroyo, a pair of Comancheros traded packs of powder and ball for mules. They, too, spoke of the mines. Not with laughter, rather with a shrug, as though addressing a stray dog that wandered too close. "One man claims he found a tunnel," one Comanchero said, tightening his saddle girth. "Timber beams so old they crumbled when he touched them. But men lie, and the mountains lie more." Elias listened, always listened. He kept his words short and his ears open, the way he'd been taught by Crow elders during the winter he spent north of the Bighorn. A man learned more by keeping his mouth shut than by filling the air with questions. Still, something about the stories tugged at him. Perhaps it was the consistency. No matter who spoke, Mexican teamsters, French trappers, American adventurers, every tale circled the same points. Spanish diggings, abandoned tunnels, a vanished party of miners, and somewhere a map that no one agreed on, no one had seen, but everyone somehow knew existed. Taos itself fed the myth. The town sat at a crossroads of the fur trade, a place where beaver pelts from the northern plains brushed shoulders with silver coins from Chihuahua, where stories carried by Crow Scouts met rumors whispered by Pueblo elders. Traders rode in from Fort Union, from Bent's Fort, from the long, dusty trails between Street Louis and Santa Fe. Some carried journals. Others carried scars. All carried stories. Elias had seen such stories become truth before. He had seen a crow hunter describe a river nobody believed existed until Jedediah Smith himself found it. He had watched a Mandan trader speak casually of a great northern lake full of beaver, only for the American Fur Company to send a party that returned with canoe loads of pelts. The West had a strange habit. Things whispered around fires sometimes became facts once a man stubborn enough went looking. But there was more to it. In Taos, Elias sensed something old beneath the laughter. A weariness. A memory the people did not entirely wish to resurrect. When he pressed, gently mentioning Spanish expeditions, the governor's records, or older Pueblo accounts, men grew quiet. Some pretended not to understand English. Others suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere. Once, late at night near the edge of the plaza, a Pueblo elder, with hair like unraveling rope, placed a hand on Elias's arm. His fingers were cool despite the heat of the day lingering in the adobe walls. "Those mines, the bonds," old man said softly. "They are not lost. They are simply left alone. Men bled there. You cannot take silver from the earth without leaving a part of your spirit behind." Elias asked nothing more. In the 1820s, the fur trade stood near its height, though trouble brewed. Beavers grew scarce in overtrapped rivers. Rival companies drove prices down. Trappers took greater risks for fewer pelts. Elias had ridden the Missouri Circuit enough to recognize a fading market. Men who once dreamed of growing rich now dreamed only of staying warm another winter. Maybe that was why the stories pulled at him. A man could ride the beaver trails for 10 more years and still end poor. But a Spanish mine, real or not, offered something greater than silver. It offered a purpose. It offered a mystery. And Elias Boone Hardesty, despite his quiet ways, was not immune to either. So he listened, he watched, and in the dusty heat of Taos, where old stories blew like sand across the plaza, he found himself wondering whether myths were simply truths that hadn't yet been found by the right pair of boots. Little did he know that before another season passed, he would discover a thing men had laughed at for generations, a thing buried in rawhide, ink, and fading Spanish memory. A map. A map no one wanted. A map that would prove every storyteller in Taos both wrong and right. It was a cold evening in Taos when the thing finally found him, or when he found it, depending on how a man believes fate works. The sun had bled out behind the Sangre de Cristo range, leaving the adobe walls stained with the last faint streaks of crimson. Coyotes barked somewhere beyond the river. Inside Doña Isabel's cantina, a cramped room thick with smoke and the sweet reek of mezcal, men argued, gambled, and lied the way frontier men always do when the night settles in. Elias Boone Hardesty had come only for a bowl of stew and a place to rest his back. He sat near the corner, close enough to the wall that no one could slip behind him, his rifle laid horizontal across his knees. The fire burned low. Shadows jittered across the mud-plastered ceiling. Dice clattered. A guitar played a slow, mournful tune that might have been Spanish or might have been invented on the spot. That was when the old muleteer staggered in. He looked like a scrap of rawhide left too long in the desert, sun-thin, cracked, and half-forgotten. His hair hung loose to his shoulders. His boots were split at the toes. A dried streak of blood clung to his jaw. Men glanced up at him the way dogs glance at a stranger's scent. The old man leaned heavily against the doorframe, breathing like each breath cost him money. "Agua," he croaked. Doña Isabel brought him a cup. He drank, coughed, and nearly collapsed. 2 vaqueros caught him under the arms and lowered him onto a bench close to the fire. Elias noticed the object the muleteer clutched against his chest, a folded bundle of rawhide tied with leather thong. The old man stroked it the way a man strokes a family Bible or a child's hair, slow and protective. When his eyes lifted, they found Elias. "You," the muleteer rasped in English, tinged with Old Spanish. "You are a trapper." Elias nodded once. "On the frontier, denying your trade only encouraged more questions." The old man motioned him forward with a trembling hand. "I have something," he whispered. "Something the others cannot read. Something they laugh at, because fools laugh at what they fear." Elias settled opposite him. Doña Isabel hovered nearby, perhaps sensing the moment's weight. The vaqueros drifted closer, pretending not to listen, but listening all the same. With stiff fingers, the muleteer untied the rawhide bundle. Inside lay a map, or something pretending to be one. It was drawn on tanned hide, yellowed with age, and stiff as bark. Ink and charcoal lines crossed its surface, some bold, some faded to shadows. The proportions looked wrong to any trained surveyor, which, thankfully, none of the men in the room were. The mountains rose where they shouldn't. Rivers forked in strange, crooked loops. Crosses marked places that might have been diggings or graves. Yet Elias recognized the intent immediately. He had seen tribal maps, Crow-buffalo hunt charts, Blackfeet river guides, Ute trail drawings etched with sticks in the dirt. They were never literal. They showed relationships, memories, directions. A mountain wasn't a mountain, it was the mountain, the one that mattered. This rawhide map had that same pulse of meaning. "This is Spanish work?" Elias asked softly. The old man nodded. His voice was thin, papery. "I carried pack trains for them. Long ago, before your American War ended, before Santa Fe was full of traders, I saw them make this, saw the officer draw it, saw the priest bless it, saw the Indians chained to the rock." A heavy quiet fell over the cantina. Men shifted. Even the guitar stilled. Elias studied the hide again. Symbols leapt to him, some familiar, others strange. A crooked star that might mark a camp, a circle around a canyon, a set of short parallel lines that resembled the Spanish habit of noting mine shafts, and near the bottom edge, half faded but still legible, a single Spanish word, soledad, solitude, or perhaps the name of a place. "This is worthless," one vaquero muttered, though the tremor in his voice betrayed uncertainty. "Spaniards drew maps like drunks draw horses." Another laughed sharply. "Sell it to a gringo. They love old lies." But the muleteer shook his head and pushed the hide toward Elias. "It is real," he whispered. "I am dying, trapper. I will not carry it further. You take it, burn it, or follow it. I do not care." His voice cracked. "But do not let them tell you it is nothing. Men died for that place. I still hear them." He sagged back against the bench, exhausted. One of the vaqueros crossed himself. Elias touched the rawhide. It felt warm, as though it held the memory of sun-baked mesas and long-buried tunnels. He did not believe in curses, nor in easy riches, but he believed in patterns. And something in this shabby relic echoed the whispers he'd heard from Camp Missouri to the Red River. "How much?" Elias asked. The muleteer shook his head. "A drink, a prayer, and a man who will not forget I spoke truth." Elias set a silver coin on the table anyway, more for the man's dignity than for the map, and rolled the hide carefully, tucking it beneath his coat. Across the room, someone laughed. Another spat and said in Spanish, "Another fool chasing shadows." Perhaps he was. But as Elias stepped into the cool night air, stars sharp above the mountains, and the rawhide map pressing against his ribs, he could not shake one thought. Myths, on this frontier, had a habit of becoming maps. And maps, sometimes, had a habit of becoming truth. For the next several years, the rawhide map traveled with Elias Boone Hardesty, the way a man carries a memory he isn't ready to examine too closely. It lived rolled tight inside his possibles bag, wrapped in a scrap of oiled cloth to keep the sweat and weather off it. He seldom unfolded it, seldom traced its crooked lines with his thumb, yet never once considered leaving it behind. It had become a quiet companion, silent, patient, waiting. The fur trade trails carried Elias far from New Mexico. The early 1820s marked the height of the beaver boom. Word spread that the upper Missouri was thick with pelts, that the Green River basin glittered with ponds untouched by traps, that every creek flowing from the Rockies held the promise of quick fortune. Men flocked to the mountains the way iron filings leap to a magnet. Some came from the east with rifles barely a year old, others drifted up from the settlements on the Arkansas. Still others crossed from Canada with French curses and paddles worn smooth by thousands of river miles. Elias moved easily among them. He wintered with a crow band on the Bighorn, learning their words for river bends and star paths. He traded at Fort Union, where the Missouri River curved like a great brown serpent and where traders spoke a dozen languages over the same campfire. He rode with an American Fur Company outfit that swore they had followed trails once traveled by Jedediah Smith, though whether that was truth or bragging, no one knew. Along the Green River, he met a mixed band of trappers, French, Métis, Delaware, and Shawnee, who had hunted the slopes of the Wind River Range for so long their moccasins seemed to know each stone by memory. And always, around night fires, came the stories. Frenchmen spoke of Vieilles mines, Espagnolas, old Spanish mines lying somewhere south of the Uintas. A Delaware hunter described strange piles of glassy black slag he'd seen in the San Juans. A Ute guide mentioned a canyon where the earth was burned like from a great cooking pit, though no village had ever stood there. Elias listened with the same patience that had served him in Taos. He never pulled out the rawhide map, never asked direct questions, never revealed more than a raised eyebrow or a small grunt of interest. A man who pushed too hard in the mountains often learned things he wished he hadn't or found himself alone in a place where alone meant dead. But slowly, year by year, a pattern formed in Elias's mind. One trapper from Fort Kiowa mentioned a ridge shaped like the hump of a sleeping buffalo, and Elias remembered the same shape drawn slanted on the rawhide. A Crow scout described a high basin where the soil shone red and where his grandfather claimed Spaniards had once dug into the earth with metal tools. On the map, near a crude charcoal mountain, Elias had seen a small circle filled with red pigment. "Them old Spaniards dug holes everywhere," one trader joked one night at the Green River rendezvous, passing a cup of watered whiskey. Half of them were looking for gold, the other half were looking for a way back to Mexico. A burst of laughter followed. Someone threw a bone into the fire. Sparks rose like angry bees. But Elias saw something the others didn't. Each story, though rough and seasoned with frontier exaggeration, pointed toward the same country. A stretch of wild land where the southern Rockies folded into the broken mesas above the Rio Grande. A land of juniper canyons, timberline lakes, and ridges so steep a man's mule walked sideways. A land the Spanish had probed but never mastered. A land where maps could be wrong and still be true. During a winter near the Yellowstone, curled in a buffalo robe while snow hissed past the lodge poles, Elias finally unrolled the rawhide map again. The smoke hole above flickered with orange firelight. Outside, wolves sang their long, lonesome songs to the frozen stars. He studied the map for hours. The lines were crooked, the mountains drawn like triangles. The rivers wandered as though the man who sketched them had lost interest halfway through. And yet, beneath the awkward shapes, Elias saw intention. The way the rivers converged did match a real pattern if one knew the Rockies the way a trapper did. The star-like symbols marked places where trails met. The strange three-line mark, three short scratches side by side now, struck him as the very same symbol the Spaniards often used to note shafts or adits. One mark near the center of the map tugged at him, a charcoal cross with a faint ring drawn around it. The old muleteer had said nothing about it, but Elias had learned enough from fur trade journals to know that Spanish prospectors often marked an especially rich vein with a cross. A priest might have blessed it. A soldier might have measured it. An Indian slave might have worked it. And on the lower edge of the map, the word that had puzzled him since the night of the cantina, Soledad. Was it a mountain, a canyon, a camp, or simply a prayer from the man who drew the map, begging solitude from the savage land? He folded the hide and tied it shut. That spring, word came that the beaver trade was wobbling. Too many trappers, too few streams untouched, too many pelts flooding St. Louis markets. Elias could feel the shift like a change in the wind. Men spoke more often of debts than of fortune. Fewer returned from the high country each winter. It was during one of these gatherings, an impromptu camp of a dozen trappers along the Sweetwater, that Elias heard a young greenhorn swear he'd seen old diggings near the upper Rio Grande. The camp erupted with laughter, but Elias's pulse quickened. Without a word, he stood, walked to his horse, and took out the rawhide map beneath the cover of darkness. The cross, the rivers, the shape of the mountains. Everything pointed south. For the first time, he knew exactly what the rawhide had been waiting for: a man willing to leave the fur trails behind and walk into the country where myths were born. The decision came to Elias Boone Hardesty the way weather comes to the mountains, not suddenly, but through a slow gathering of signs that only seem obvious once the storm breaks. The beaver trade was faltering. The great rivers were thinning out. Men who once boasted about making a pack horse grown with pelts now counted themselves lucky to fill even a single bundle. And everywhere Elias traveled, Fort Union, the Green River, the Wind River meet, he felt the same uneasy shift. The mountains were no longer the untouched treasury they had been. It was in the spring thaw along the Sweetwater that he finally said the words aloud. "I'm heading south," Elias murmured, mostly to himself, as he tightened the cinch on his mule. But a French Métis named Lucien Montbrun, wiry as willow bark and twice as stubborn, heard him anyway. "South?" Lucien spat into the dirt. "Only dust and dry canyons that way. You chasing beaver or chasing ghosts?" "Neither," Elias replied. Lucien studied him for a long moment, his dark eyes narrowing. The two men had trapped together for nearly 3 seasons. Lucien knew Elias was not prone to foolish whims. "This about the map you don't let nobody see?" Elias said nothing. Lucien grunted. "Fine, south then. But you won't get far without someone who knows the country." The someone in question turned out to be Mateo Renteria, a New Mexican teamster who had run supply strings between Santa Fe and the northern pueblos since boyhood. Mateo was a compact man, cheerful even when the world turned mean, and he knew every hidden spring between Taos and Abiquiu. When Elias explained carefully that he sought old Spanish workings, Mateo raised one eyebrow. "My father spoke of such places," he said, "but everybody says they are cursed." "That so?" Elias asked. Mateo shrugged. "Cursed or not, they pay no taxes, which is more than I can say for Santa Fe." The third member of the small party was a Ute hunter named Taos, tall and broad-shouldered, with hair bound in a single long braid. Taos joined them without ceremony, as though he had always intended to. He said little at first, though when he spoke, his words carried weight. "My grandfather told stories of men with iron hats who dug holes in the mountains," Taos explained one evening. "They took Indians from many tribes, chained them, made them carry rocks. Then, one winter, they were gone. Nobody knew why, but the mountain remembered." "What mountain?" Lucien asked. Taos pointed silently toward the southern horizon. The sun bled through the clouds, staining the peaks the color of smoldering coals. "Those." And so the 4 men rode south. The country between the northern plains and New Mexico was a strange mixture of comfort and danger: wide sagebrush flats broken by sudden canyons, cottonwoods lining the trickling streams, and mesas rising like the hulls of ancient ships stranded in stone. Elias, who had spent years in the dripping forests and steep river bottoms of the northern Rockies, found this land unsettling in its openness. A man could see trouble coming from miles away, but that also meant trouble could see him. They traveled lightly, just enough flour, dried meat, powder, and ball to last a month. Beaver traps were left behind. There was no point lugging them into country that held more sun than streams. Elias carried only his rifle, his possibles bag, the rawhide map, and his quiet way of watching the horizon. Each night they made small fires, no bigger than a hat brim. Taos insisted. "In this land," he said, "a big fire is seen by every hungry thing." By the 3rd day, the rawhide map left its hiding place. Elias unfolded it under the shade of a pinyon tree, weighing its corners with stones. The inked mountains, crooked and childlike, bore little resemblance to the jagged horizon ahead. But the relationships, the way one river bent toward another, the way a basin sat cradled between two ridges, those felt right. Lucien crouched beside him. "Map looks drunk." "Most maps from the old days do," Elias replied, "but I think this one knows something." Mateo whistled. "If we find silver, we'll drink mezcal in Santa Fe until we forget our names." Elias shook his head. "I'm not after silver. I want to see if the stories are true." Taos stared at the hide for a long time, then touched a symbol, 3 short lines scratched side by side. "This means digging," he said. "Some of our old storytellers use the same mark." Elias felt a prickle run along his spine. A piece of the puzzle had just clicked. The land grew harsher as they moved south. Mesas rose higher. Canyons deepened into twisting mazes. Heat shimmered on the rocks, turning the world to liquid. Water became precious. When they found a spring, a thin trickle seeping from a sandstone lip, they drank slowly, like men in prayer. On the 6th day, Taos led them into a narrow defile where the wind whispered along the stone walls. The trail bent sharply, weaving between hoodoos shaped by centuries of sun and storm. At its end, the canyon opened into a high basin, ringed by ridges like the rim of a bowl. Elias felt his breath catch. The basin looked exactly like the crude circle inked on the rawhide, but they were not alone in their discovery. Scattered across the basin were signs old, weathered, half swallowed by time. Piles of broken stone, a few squared timbers lying collapsed in the grass, a shallow trench filled with rubble. And near the base of the ridge, a dark opening, a tunnel mouth choked with debris. Lucien knelt beside a rusted fragment of iron. "This is no Indian work," he murmured. Mateo crossed himself. "Madre de Dios," the old stories were true. Taos said nothing. His eyes tracked the slopes, wary, respectful like a man. Standing in a burial ground, Elias stepped toward the collapsed tunnel, heart pounding. The rawhide map had not lied, nor had the muleteer. They had found the place where Spaniards once dug into the bones of the mountains. The lost mines were real. And now, the mountain would decide what it meant to have them found again. The basin lay in a hush so deep it felt older than memory, a silence held not by absence, but by the weight of everything that had once happened here. Even the wind seemed to tread lightly as it slid across the slopes. Elias Boone Hardesty stood at the edge of the collapsed tunnel, boots planted in gravel mixed with fragments of timber so aged they crumbled under a fingertip. Sunlight poured over the ridge behind him, but the tunnel mouth remained in shadow as though the mountain itself preferred to keep its secrets in the dark. Lucien Montbrun knelt beside a half-buried beam and brushed soil away with his knife. "Squared with a broad axe," he murmured. "Spanish style. You can see the angle." Mateo Renteria was studying the ground farther upslope, where the soil was streaked with bands of red and gray. "Ore spoil," he said. "Thin, but definitely ore. They worked hard for whatever was here." Taos did not touch anything. He stood with arms folded, watching the ridges as though expecting them to shift. "This place is wrong," he said quietly. "The ground remembers pain." Elias crouched and pressed his palm to the earth. It was warm, sun-warmed, nothing more, but still he felt something beneath the heat. A heaviness. A story whispered through dust and silence. The rawhide map had led them truly, but the truth was not the shining treasure men liked to brag about in taverns. It was work. Hard, brutal, back-breaking work, done by men who had given their sweat and perhaps their lives. Elias studied the collapsed entrance. The timbers had given way long ago, leaving a jagged maw packed with shale and dust. No telling how deep the shaft went, perhaps 10 feet, perhaps 100. Spanish miners were notorious for chasing veins far beyond safety. Lucien spat into the dirt. "No gold that I can see." Mateo laughed bitterly. "If there was, the Spaniards took it 200 years ago." "Not all of it," Elias said. "They didn't finish the job. No smelter remains." Mateo blinked. "How do you know?" Elias pointed to a cluster of stones arranged in a semicircle a short distance away. Weathered charcoal flecked the ground around them, but the stones were too small and the pattern too scattered. That might have been a camp hearth, Elias explained. But a real smelter? It leaves slag glass-like stuff, heavy, black, twisted. We haven't seen much of that yet. Taos nodded. My grandfather said the men who dug here fled quickly. They left the earth open, like a wound, not healing. Lucien scanned the basin. Then where did they smelt the ore? Elias looked up toward the far ridge, where a faint trail climbed into the timber. Higher, he said. If they wanted better draft for the fire, they would have built their furnace where the wind could reach it. They hiked upward, boots slipping on loose scree. The air thinned, shadows lengthened. When they reached the ridge crest, the land opened into a small, bowl-shaped hollow, sheltered from the worst of the wind. And there, half swallowed by centuries of fallen needles and soil, they found it, a Spanish smelter. What remained of it, anyway. A low stone structure, barely waist-high, built in a rough circle. The interior was lined with heat-scorched clay. Fragments of slag, black, glassy, sharp, lay scattered like broken teeth around its perimeter. A rusted iron wedge protruded from the ground nearby, fused into a lump of cooled metal. Mateo let out a low whistle. Madre de Dios! This is real. Lucien tapped a slag piece with his flint striker. It rang like iron. They were working silver, not gold. Elias examined a stone bearing streaks of greenish glaze silver ore melted under high heat. Silver explains the secrecy, he said, and the Spanish guards, and the stories. Taos didn't step closer. Instead, he traced the tree line with his eyes. Silver takes men, he murmured. My grandfather said the men here were afraid of the mountain. They made the Utes dig the tunnels. When the snows came early, they ran. Some died in the pass. The basin suddenly felt colder. Elias knew enough history to fill in the rest. Spanish colonial records spoke of forced Indian labor, of expeditions lost to winter storms, of prospecting ventures abandoned without explanation. The Pueblo Revolt, the Comanche Wars, and simple geographic isolation all played their parts. These mines had never stood a chance. But the rawhide map had remembered them, and now he had seen them with his own eyes. Lucien sat on a fallen log and wiped sweat from his forehead. So what now? You got your proof. No treasure left. No ore worth smelting. Mateo nodded. Even if we had a mule train, hauling silver out of here would take months. And there's nothing rich enough to bother. Elias didn't answer immediately. He walked to the basin's southern edge, where the view dropped into a labyrinth of ridges and canyons. The land stretched away in folds, blue with distance, harsh and beautiful and utterly empty. Somewhere beyond those shadows lay the Rio Grande. Somewhere beyond that, the faint murmur of settlements. He felt the weight of the moment settle in his chest. I didn't come for the silver, he said softly. I came to see if the stories were true. Taos regarded him with something like respect. They are, Lucien snorted. Fine, but I prefer stories with bottles of whiskey at the end. Mateo chuckled. But Elias felt something else, something unexpected. The basin held more than tunnels and slag piles. It held answers. Proof that myths could be real. Proof that the land still kept secrets older than the fur trade, older than any map printed in Street Louis. He knelt beside the collapsed tunnel and placed his hand on the timbers. History was here, buried, forgotten, waiting. And the mountain, for now, was willing to let him listen. They found the storm before the storm found them. An old mountain truth, Elias Boone Hardesty trusted more than any map. Storms in the southern Rockies had a way of appearing without warning, billowing over ridgelines like cavalry charges, swallowing the sky in a matter of minutes. But this one announced itself early. A long, low rumble rolling across the basin, a sudden metallic scent in the air, the feeling that the earth itself had drawn a slow breath. Taos read it first. Snow, he said, scanning the sky. Hard snow. Soon. Lucien cursed in French. We're too high for that kind of weather. Mateo pointed toward the tree line below the smelter ruins. There is no shelter close. Only brush and rock. Elias studied the basin, the ridges, the slope leading into the timber. He'd wintered in places far worse than this and survived mostly because he had learned to think faster than the weather. He felt the pressure drop, tasted the cold on the wind. They had maybe 2 hours before the sky broke open. "That stand of spruce down there," Elias said, pointing. "We'll make shelter." "Shelter?" Lucien barked a laugh. "In 2 hours?" "Less," Taos added, watching the clouds pile like boulders. Elias didn't argue. Arguing burned daylight. Instead, he slung his possibles bag over his shoulder and started down the slope. The others followed, more because they trusted his instincts than because they believed success was possible. They reached the spruce stand just as the wind sharpened. The trees were tall, close set, thick with low branches, good protection from the first lash of the storm. Snow flurries already spun in the air. Lucien crossed his arms. "So what now? A brush lean-to?" "No," Elias said. "We build a cabin." Mateo stared at him. "A cabin? In 2 hours you're loco." Taos tilted his head, curious. "What kind of cabin?" "The fast kind," Elias said simply. He set to work. Years in the northern Rockies had taught him something most frontier men never learned. Speed did not come from strength. It came from method. From the Crow, Elias had learned how to use slope and gravity instead of muscle. From the Blackfeet, he'd learned that a wall didn't need to be built piece by piece if you could build it flat on the ground first. From the Missouri forts, he'd learned how to scribe notches quickly, using an axe and a single guiding cut. So he chose a spot, a patch of relatively level ground beneath the thickest trees, and began issuing instructions. "Taos, bring me the straightest logs you can drop, 6, maybe 7 inches thick. Lucien, you help him cut. Mateo, clear, brush, make room." The others moved, still skeptical but willing. They had seen Elias's quiet competence more than once. Elias felled the first log himself. A few clean strokes, measured, efficient. He trimmed the knots, then used his axe to score shallow V-shaped notches on each end half the usual depth, just enough to lock the corners. He laid the log on the ground. Then he felled another, and another. "Stacking?" Lucien asked breathlessly, watching the pattern. "No stacking," Elias said. "Laying out." By the time the wind shifted from warning to howl, Elias had 20 logs trimmed and notched. The others had caught on. Taos' powerful swings dropped timber quickly. Lucien trimmed the ends. Mateo hauled them into place. They laid the logs flat on the ground, one atop another, forming a rectangular wall, just not yet upright. Mateo wiped his brow. "Senor, you're building sideways." Elias nodded. "That's the idea." When the 2 walls reached shoulder height, he drove 2 lever poles beneath them, long saplings stripped clean, and angled them like giant pry bars. Lucien blinked. "We're going to lift them?" "Roll them," Elias corrected. Onto their base. The storm chose that moment to break. Snow came hard and fast, thick flakes whipping sideways. The wind roared through the trees like a river turned upside down. "Now!" Elias shouted. The 3 men heaved on the lever poles while Elias guided from the inside. The wall rolled not smoothly, but steadily pivoting up until gravity took over and slammed the logs into place on the flattened bed of earth Mateo had cleared. The notches locked against the base logs. The wall stood like it had always belonged there. Lucien stared, snow clinging to his beard. Mon Dieu, that should not have worked. Taos grinned. It worked. The second wall went up faster. The technique, crazy as it looked, was efficient. Build the wall flat, tight, quick. Then raise it with levers instead of lifting logs one by one. In less than an hour, they had 2 walls standing. Elias angled them slightly inward, as the Crow often did for winter lodges, to help shed snow. They lashed ridgepoles between them. Spruce boughs went over that, then hides, then earth. A roof took shape in the blinding storm, simple and sturdy. By the time the basin vanished under a curtain of white, the cabin stood small, rough, but warmable. Inside, a shallow trench served as a windbreak for the fire. They spread spruce branches for bedding. Taos sealed gaps between logs with mud and moss until the cabin smelled like a whole mountainside pressed into a single room. When the fire finally caught and heat began to push back the cold, Lucien looked at Elias in disbelief. "You built a cabin," he said, shaking his head. "A cabin. In 1 hour. Closer to half," Mateo corrected, teeth chattering as he warmed himself. Taos gazed at the walls, then at Elias. "My, people will want to see this trick." Elias shrugged modestly. "It's not a trick. Just a way of working with the land instead of against it." Lucien laughed. "Call it whatever you want." "It's crazy." Maybe it was. But as the storm raged outside and the hastily built cabin held firm, defying wind, snow, and common sense, it felt less like madness and more like survival. And Elias Boone Hardesty knew, though he didn't say it aloud, that the mountains had just taught him something important. Ingenuity, not luck, was what kept a man alive. The storm lasted through the night and half the next day, hammering the small cabin with fists of wind and thick curtains of snow. The spruce groaned. The roof creaked. But the walls those hastily built, lever lifted, crazy walls held, the fire kept burning. And Elias Boone Hardesty, sitting cross-legged near the low flames, felt something rare in the mountains, a sense of calm. Not safety, no man ever truly felt safe in high country like this, but a quiet confidence that he and his companions had outwitted the worst the sky could throw at them. When the storm finally broke, it did so with theatrical suddenness. Clouds tore apart. Sunlight spilled over the basin in blinding white. The world outside glowed, reshaped by a fresh layer of snow that softened every rock and masked every old scar. Even the abandoned Spanish works looked gentler under that white blanket, as though time had laid a shroud over the suffering once carved into the stone. Lucien pushed open the cabin door and stepped into knee-deep drifts. "Looks like a whole new world," he said, squinting against the glare. Mateo whistled. "Madre de Dios, I can't feel my toes." Taos, unbothered by the cold, moved silently across the open basin, examining tracks half filled with snow. "Deer," he said. "And something else. A cat, maybe." Elias emerged last, the rawhide map tucked into his coat. He stood for a long moment, breathing in the sharp mountain air, letting the cold sting his lungs. Something about the basin felt changed not just by the storm, but by the simple fact that they had survived it together. Hard places do that. They bind men. Still, whether or no weather, the truth remained. There was nothing left here worth taking. The Spaniards had exhausted what ore they could reach. The smelter ruins confirmed that. The tunnels were half collapsed, dangerous even for curious eyes. And even if silver remained deeper inside the mountains, 4 men could no more mine it than they could move a river. Lucien said it first. "We can't stay. Snow this early means the high passes will be hell in a week." Elias nodded. "We head out tomorrow." Mateo sighed with relief. Taos simply nodded. But before they left, Elias wanted one more look, not for wealth, but for understanding. He walked alone to the collapsed tunnel, brushing snow away from the timbers. He crouched and placed his fingers on the chilled wood. The old muleteer had been right. The stories had been right. The map had not been a myth. So what, then, had he found? Not treasure. That much was clear. Not wealth. The mountains never yielded that easily. What Elias Boone Hardesty found in this lonely basin was something quieter, older, and for a certain kind of man, far more valuable. Truth. The truth behind a centuries-old rumor. The truth of people who had worked and died far from home. The truth that the land remembers everything. He studied the map again, spreading the hide across a flat rock. The symbols almost seemed to shift now that he knew their meaning. The crooked mountains resembled the ridges above him. The rivers matched the faint lines of the drainage below. The circle, yes, that was the basin. The 3 short scratches, those marked the tunnels. The charcoal cross, clearly the smelter site. And near the bottom edge, the word that had puzzled him from the beginning, Soledad. It struck him suddenly, with a clarity that felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The map wasn't naming a mountain or a canyon. It was naming the place itself. Not a location, an experience. Soledad, solitude. The solitude of men digging into the bones of the earth. The solitude of Indian slaves, forced to work in a wilderness no priest could tame. The solitude of soldiers guarding a silver vein while the world around them starved. The solitude that lingered centuries later, even now, even under fresh snow. Elias folded the hide slowly. When he turned back toward camp, Taos stood on the ridge above him. "You found what you came for," the Ute hunter said. Elias nodded. "I reckon I did." "Then, what will you do with it?" Elias glanced at the rawhide. The map felt different now, not a clue to riches, but a piece of history only a handful of living men understood. "Maybe nothing," he said. "Not every truth needs telling." Taos' gaze softened. Wise, the descent from the basin was slow. Snow clung to the ridges, turning the trail into a narrow ribbon of white perched above steep drop-offs. But Elias and his companions knew the mountains well. They moved steady, cautious, reading the land in a way only men of the frontier ever truly could. By the time they reached the lower country, the map had become a quiet weight in Elias's coat, not a promise, not a burden, but a reminder. And though he didn't know it then, the story would travel farther than any of them could guess. Years later, a trader passing through Taos would write in his journal about a mountain man who had found the old Spanish diggings. A retired dragoon stationed near Santa Fe would mention a Hardesty who claimed to see ruins older than any pueblo. A Ute elder would speak of a white man who listened to the land and respected the stories. And long after the fur trade died, after the beaver were trapped out, after the rendezvous ended, after the mountains filled with settlers and surveyors, Elias Boone Hardesty's crazy cabin trick would be quietly borrowed by homesteaders who needed fast shelter in hard weather. A cabin built flat and lifted upright. A cabin raised by levers, not luck. A cabin made with the wisdom of mountains. Not a myth, not a legend, just a frontier truth carried forward. And somewhere in a chest no one else opened, wrapped in oiled cloth and memory, the rawhide map remained, its lines still crooked, its secrets still intact, its meaning no longer the promise of riches, but the mark of the man who proved that sometimes